The United Kingdom stands at the precipice of an unprecedented political catastrophe as a seismic rift between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and King Charles threatens to send shockwaves through the very foundations of British governance. This is not just another political spat or a routine disagreement between Downing Street and Buckingham Palace. This is a full-blown confrontation between the elected leader of the nation and the reigning monarch, and the stakes could not be higher. At the heart of this escalating crisis lies Ukraine. More specifically, the deep divide between Starmer's hardline stance on continued military support and King Charles's growing alarm over the economic fallout that looms on the horizon. The king, in an extraordinary and near unprecedented move, has voiced his concerns openly, warning that the tariffs threatened by President Trump could plunge the UK into economic turmoil. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, Starmer refuses to budge. The question is, why? Why is the Prime Minister so adamantly defying not just the monarch, but also the cold, hard economic reality staring him in the face? Let's be clear, this is not a monarch overstepping his constitutional bounds out of personal whim or ego. This is a head of state who sees disaster coming and is trying to pull the emergency brake before Britain derails entirely. The king is not making policy, he is fulfilling his duty to warn of an impending crisis. And make no mistake, crisis is exactly what we are staring down. The numbers alone are terrifying. The potential tariffs from Trump's administration could cost Britain up to £32 billion annually in lost exports. That's not just a hit to the economy, that's 400,000 jobs gone overnight. Manufacturing, financial services, agriculture, all of them facing devastation. And what is Starmer's response? Dismissal. Incredibly, instead of engaging in meaningful dialogue with the king or even acknowledging the catastrophic economic repercussions of his Ukraine policy, he has doubled down. Sources within Buckingham Palace describe a particularly explosive meeting where Starmer outright dismissed the king's concerns as outside the scope of royal prerogative, a move that reportedly left Charles furious. Think about this for a moment. The Prime Minister, who is supposed to represent the best interests of the British people, is brushing off an economic disaster that his own Treasury officials are scrambling to contain. Meanwhile, the king, a figure historically bound to remain above the political fray, feels so compelled by the severity of the situation that he is breaking precedent to intervene. This is not normal. This is a political and constitutional time bomb ticking away in real time. And it gets worse. Public sentiment is shifting against Starmer at a speed rarely seen in modern British politics. The latest polls show that a staggering 62% of Britons now support the king's position and believe that economic stability should take priority over unwavering military aid to Ukraine. Among Labour voters, the discontent is even more shocking. 58% of those who backed Starmer in the last election now say they side with the king. This is not just a minor dip in the polls, this is the kind of political collapse that has ended prime ministerial careers in a matter of weeks. Labour's approval ratings are in freefall, with Starmer's net rating plummeting to -18%, a devastating low for a government that was supposed to usher in stability after 14 years of Conservative rule. Instead, the nation is now watching in real time as Labour implodes under the weight of its own arrogance and detachment from reality. And just when you think it couldn't possibly get worse, enter Reform UK. Nigel Farage, ever the political opportunist, has seized on this crisis with masterful precision, throwing his full support behind the king and capitalising on Labour's disarray. His latest Standing with the King tour has drawn record crowds across the country, particularly in Labour's traditional strongholds. Make no mistake, this is the most dangerous threat to Labour's hold on power since its landslide victory. Reform UK has surged to 28% in national polling, overtaking the Conservatives and now just 5 points behind Labour. If an election were called tomorrow, Labour wouldn't just lose, it would be annihilated. And let's not forget the constitutional firestorm now raging in the background. Experts are openly debating whether King Charles might invoke the Crown's reserve powers, a move not seen in modern times, to force new elections if Starmer continues down this reckless path. Until recently, the very idea of royal intervention in politics was unthinkable. But we are now in uncharted constitutional waters, and for the first time in generations, there is genuine talk that the king could act against the sitting prime minister if the economic and political damage becomes irreparable. Even within Labour, cracks are widening at a rapid pace. Senior ministers are said to be in open rebellion, with whispers of resignations if Starmer refuses to reconsider his stance. Treasury insiders have confirmed that Rachel Reeves herself has warned Starmer that his policies are unsustainable, and if the Chancellor goes, the government could very well collapse. And let's talk about the optics of this situation. King Charles has been visiting factories, farms, and industries across the country, speaking directly with the people who will bear the brunt of Trump's tariffs. Meanwhile, where is Starmer? Hiding behind closed doors at Chequers, desperately trying to cling to a policy that even his own party no longer fully supports. The contrast could not be more striking. A king seen as in touch with the struggles of ordinary Britons. A prime minister increasingly isolated, defiant, and dangerously out of step with reality. And as for international reaction? The damage is already being felt. European leaders are distancing themselves from Starmer, with French President Marine Le Pen and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz subtly signaling alignment with King Charles's pragmatism rather than Labour's ideological rigidity. Even worse, President Trump himself has weighed in, bluntly stating on Truth Social, "King Charles gets it. Time for Starmer to listen or get out of the way." Under any other circumstances, a direct intervention from a sitting US president in British domestic politics would be a scandal in itself. But here? The public is largely agreeing with Trump's assessment. That's how deeply unpopular Starmer's position has become. And so we reach the breaking point. Will Starmer bend to the inevitable, acknowledge the economic realities, and shift his policy before it's too late? Or will he choose to fight a battle he has already lost, further deepening the crisis and potentially forcing the king's hand in ways Britain has not seen for generations? If the Prime Minister thinks he can simply wait this out, he is catastrophically mistaken. The king is not backing down. The public is not backing down. The economy is teetering on the brink. The question now is not if Starmer will break, but when. The crisis engulfing Britain's highest echelons of power is not just another political squabble. This is a constitutional earthquake that threatens to rip apart the delicate balance between Parliament and the monarchy. For the first time in modern history, a sitting Prime Minister is locked in a full-scale confrontation with the King, not over some ceremonial duty, not over an abstract legal debate, but over the very survival of the British economy. And the numbers don't lie. A staggering £32 billion in potential trade losses. Hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk. The spectre of tariffs from the United States looms like a guillotine over British industries, from manufacturing to financial services, from agriculture to tech exports. And yet, Keir Starmer refuses to listen. He refuses to acknowledge the storm that is about to crash down on the nation. Why? What is so important about his rigid stance on Ukraine that he is willing to sacrifice the livelihoods of British workers, throw the economy into chaos, and stand alone against the King, the public, and even his own party? This is not principled leadership. This is blind arrogance, political self-destruction in real time. The King, historically bound to remain a neutral figurehead, has now been forced into the heart of the political arena. And let's be clear, this is not a king acting out of personal ambition. This is a monarch desperately trying to prevent economic catastrophe, stepping into the void where responsible government should have been. And Starmer's reaction? Dismissal. Contempt. A reckless belief that he can steamroll over not just the king, but the will of the British people themselves. According to sources within Buckingham Palace, the tension during their last private audience at the palace was palpable. What was supposed to be a routine discussion exploded into a bitter exchange. Starmer reportedly dismissed the king's warnings as irrelevant, claiming economic concerns were not the monarchy's responsibility. That response, breathtaking in its arrogance, was a direct insult not just to King Charles, but to the millions of Britons whose futures are hanging in the balance. Palace insiders say the king was visibly furious, reminding Starmer that his duty as monarch is to protect the welfare of his people. And right now, that means preventing economic disaster at the hands of a stubborn, out-of-touch Prime Minister. But the damage doesn't stop there. Labour's approval ratings are in free fall. Starmer's personal rating has sunk to negative 18%, a historic low that signals just how little faith the British people now have in his leadership. His government, once heralded as a return to stability after the turbulence of the Johnson and Truss years, is now seen as a rudderless ship heading straight for the rocks. Meanwhile, the king's popularity has soared. He is now viewed as the voice of reason, the protector of British interests against a prime minister hellbent on economic ruin. A stunning 62% of Britons now side with the king on this issue, and within Labour's own voter base, the cracks are growing at an alarming rate. More than half of Labour's own supporters now believe Starmer is wrong. This is a political death spiral, and it's accelerating. And then there's the Farage factor. Nigel Farage, the master of political insurgency, has wasted no time in capitalizing on Starmer's catastrophic miscalculation. His Reform UK party, once dismissed as a fringe movement, is now polling at 28%, overtaking the Conservatives and breathing down Labour's neck. Farage's message? Simple, devastatingly effective, and perfectly timed. The king gets it. Starmer doesn't. At rally after rally, in Labour's former strongholds, the Reform UK leader is tapping into a wave of public fury. He is positioning himself as the only political figure standing in defence of British jobs, British industry, British prosperity. And the Labour Party? They are paralysed. Behind closed doors, panic is setting in. Senior figures in the cabinet are now actively discussing whether Starmer's leadership is sustainable. Treasury officials are said to be preparing for the very real possibility of a financial crisis if tariffs hit. And Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, Starmer's supposed right-hand woman, is, according to leaks from Downing Street, on the verge of resigning if the Prime Minister refuses to shift course. And let's not forget the international picture. Britain is not just facing a domestic political war, it is now at risk of becoming an international outcast. President Trump, never one to hold back, has publicly humiliated Starmer, blasting him as just another weak globalist politician who doesn't understand economics. The White House is now actively snubbing Downing Street, refusing to engage at a meaningful diplomatic level. And European leaders? They are distancing themselves. French President Marine Le Pen has already hinted at shifting her stance to align more closely with Trump's policies. Germany is now quietly recalibrating its approach. Britain, once a leading force in European diplomacy, is being left behind, all because of one man's inexplicable refusal to adapt to reality. And here's the most staggering part. The king might not back down. This is no longer just a policy dispute, this is a full-blown constitutional crisis. There is growing speculation that King Charles might take the unprecedented step of invoking the Crown's reserve powers. These powers, rarely spoken of, almost never used, allow the monarch to act in extraordinary circumstances, including the dissolution of Parliament if a government is deemed to be acting against fundamental national interests. Would Charles go that far? No one knows. But the fact that we are even having this conversation is proof of how serious this crisis has become. And what of Starmer? Does he really think he can just ride this out? That if he ignores the king, ignores the economy, ignores the public, this will all somehow disappear? It won't. The king is not backing down. The public is not backing down. Reform UK is surging. The economy is teetering on the brink. The Labour Party is fracturing before our very eyes. The only question left is how much more damage Starmer is willing to inflict on himself and the country before he is forced to face reality. Keir Starmer is gambling with Britain's future, and the stakes couldn't be higher. He's not just making bad decisions, he's making disastrous ones, throwing billions into an untested, unrealistic fantasy while the country teeters on the brink of financial and institutional collapse. His grand plan? A sweeping, AI-driven transformation of government that's supposed to miraculously save £45 billion. But here's the truth, it won't work. It can't work. And worse, it's going to cost the taxpayer billions before we even realize we've been conned. If this all sounds familiar, it's because we've been here before. Britain has a long, painful history of government-led tech failures. Remember the NHS IT disaster, which wasted £10 billion and achieved next to nothing? Or Universal Credit's botched digital rollout, which left thousands of vulnerable people without financial support for months. These aren't minor hiccups. These are catastrophic failures, and Starmer is charging full speed ahead into yet another one, except this time, it's on a scale that could make all previous debacles look like minor accounting errors. And here's the contradiction at the heart of Starmer's AI obsession. While he claims to be streamlining government, his administration is creating bureaucracy at an unprecedented rate. 25 new quangos since taking office. That's a new bureaucratic body every single week, each one an expensive black hole for taxpayer money. How do you simplify governance while simultaneously building the largest red tape factory in British political history? The answer is simple: you don't. This is classic politician doublespeak. Starmer wants you to believe he's cutting costs, but the reality is he's throwing money at problems with no clear solution in sight. These new bureaucracies will inevitably complicate any AI implementation, creating more layers of administration, more inefficiency, and more opportunities for waste. The irony? The very system that's supposed to make government leaner and more efficient is being smothered before it even begins. And what about the actual AI itself? Starmer is treating artificial intelligence as a magic wand, something he can wave over the government and, poof, efficiency, savings, and progress will appear out of thin air. But technology doesn't work like that. AI systems require high-quality data, proper governance frameworks, and rigorous oversight. You can't just install ChatGPT on a government computer and expect decades of institutional dysfunction to fix itself overnight. More worryingly, who exactly is in charge of this AI revolution? Does Starmer have a detailed plan? A roadmap? A strategy beyond vague soundbites and PR gimmicks? Or is this just another political stunt designed to make headlines without delivering results? Because when you strip away the flashy rhetoric, all you're left with is a government throwing billions at a black box and hoping for the best. And make no mistake, this isn't just about financial recklessness. This is about power. The more government services become dependent on AI, the more control those in power will have over the population. AI-driven governance means automated decision-making, centralized data collection, and less human oversight, all of which increase the risk of bureaucratic overreach, mismanagement, and even outright abuse. What happens when AI systems start making errors in benefit calculations, wrongly denying support to thousands? What happens when critical healthcare decisions are left in the hands of flawed algorithms? We've already seen what happens when governments rush into technological revolutions without proper safeguards. Look at the Netherlands, where a government-run AI system wrongly accused thousands of families of benefit fraud, devastating lives and forcing the Prime Minister to resign. Look at the Post Office Horizon scandal, where hundreds of innocent postmasters were falsely prosecuted due to a faulty IT system. Now imagine those failures on a national scale, across every branch of government. That's the path Starmer is taking us down. And it's not just AI failures that pose a risk, it's the money being thrown at this boondoggle before we've even seen a single benefit. Billions of pounds will be sunk into this initiative before taxpayers see a single penny of those promised savings. Civil service unions have already raised serious concerns about the cost, the feasibility, and the massive redundancies that will come as a result. Because let's be clear, AI doesn't streamline government, it cuts jobs. Starmer's digital revolution isn't about making things work better, it's about slashing costs at any cost, leaving thousands of public sector workers, real people, with families, mortgages, and livelihoods, out in the cold. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. These are workers who keep the country running, and Starmer is treating them as expendable collateral damage in his reckless pursuit of a techno-utopian fantasy. What makes this even more dangerous is that Starmer doesn't understand technology. He's not a tech expert. He's not a digital strategist. He's a career politician who is blindly following a Silicon Valley pipe dream without considering the consequences. It's the same reckless mindset that led to governments worldwide dumping billions into failed blockchain projects and pointless smart city initiatives that never materialized. Starmer is betting the future of Britain on a concept he doesn't even fully grasp, and we're the ones who will pay the price when it fails. And let's talk about legal implications. If Starmer knowingly pushes forward an AI-driven reform that is fundamentally flawed, if billions of taxpayer pounds vanish without tangible results, could that constitute criminal misuse of public funds? If AI systems lead to mass wrongful benefit rejections, incorrect tax calculations, or discriminatory decision-making, could that open the government to lawsuits and legal challenges? The reality is, this isn't just an economic risk, it's a legal minefield. And here's the real kicker. While Starmer publicly distances himself from figures like Donald Trump, he's actually copying Trump's governance model, the same slash-and-burn approach to bureaucracy, the same blind faith in corporate-driven solutions, the same reckless gamble with public money. The only difference? Trump at least understood that the private sector drives technological progress, while Starmer wants the government, arguably the most inefficient entity in existence, to control it all. This isn't leadership. This is a reckless experiment with Britain's future. And the people who will pay the price aren't politicians in Westminster, they're ordinary taxpayers, working-class families, and civil servants who will be left picking up the pieces when this inevitably collapses under its own weight. The writing is on the wall. The tech experts are warning us, the economists are sounding the alarm, and the civil service unions are preparing for the worst. But Starmer? He's doubling down on a fantasy, a multi-billion-pound vanity project that could end up being one of the most expensive political mistakes in British history. And when it fails, because it will fail, the only question left will be, who will be held accountable? The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is teetering on the edge of political oblivion, and yet he refuses to see the writing on the wall. Keir Starmer is not just facing a political crisis, he is presiding over a slow-motion collapse of his authority, his government, and perhaps even the stability of the British state itself. The numbers are apocalyptic: £32 billion in potential losses from Trump's threatened tariffs, over 400,000 British jobs on the line, entire industries at risk of collapse. And yet, Starmer clings to his rigid foreign policy stance as if it were some sacred doctrine, unwilling, or perhaps incapable, of recognizing the disaster unfolding around him. This is no longer just a question of Ukraine. This is about Britain's economic survival. And while Starmer buries his head in the sand, King Charles has taken on the mantle of leadership that the Prime Minister has so catastrophically abandoned. This is unprecedented. Never before in modern history has a British monarch found himself at direct odds with his government on a matter of such consequence. And the public? They are siding with the king. The latest polling is beyond damning. A staggering 62% of Britons now believe that Starmer should prioritize economic stability over his unwavering support for Ukraine. And among Labour's own voter base, the numbers are even more shocking. 58% of those who backed Starmer in the last election now say they agree with the king. This isn't just a slump in popularity. This is an outright rejection of Starmer's leadership. Meanwhile, Reform UK is capitalising on Labour's implosion with ruthless efficiency. Nigel Farage, the consummate political opportunist, has seized on the crisis, aligning himself with the king and presenting himself as the true voice of the British people. And the strategy is working. Reform is now polling at 28%, overtaking the Tories and closing in on Labour. What once seemed unthinkable is now becoming a genuine possibility. Farage could ride this wave of public outrage straight into Downing Street. And the Labour Party? It is eating itself alive. Chancellor Rachel Reeves, already floundering with a disastrous net approval rating of -25%, is privately warning Starmer that the government's economic position is unsustainable. Treasury officials have been working through the night, frantically drafting contingency plans for an economic meltdown if American tariffs are imposed. But what good will a contingency plan do when businesses are already preparing for the worst? Manufacturers, financial firms, and agricultural exporters have sounded the alarm. Some of Britain's biggest employers are now openly discussing layoffs, factory closures, and relocation plans. Economic catastrophe isn't some distant possibility, it's a countdown. And yet, Starmer remains obstinate, deaf to the pleas from within his own ranks. And that is where the real danger lies. Because this crisis is no longer just economic, it is constitutional. For weeks, speculation has been building that King Charles could be forced to take unprecedented action. Royal prerogative powers, long thought to be mere relics of history, are now being discussed in the halls of power as a very real possibility. Constitutional experts are openly debating whether the king has the authority to dissolve parliament and force a new election if the government is seen to be acting against the national interest. Could Charles actually do it? The fact that we are even asking this question speaks volumes about the scale of this crisis. And yet, the palace's actions suggest they are preparing for just such a moment. Royal legal teams have been expanded. Constitutional scholars have been summoned for private briefings. Buckingham Palace is not simply standing by and watching this unfold. They are preparing. Meanwhile, the international community is losing patience. President Trump has wasted no time publicly humiliating Starmer, calling him a globalist fool and warning that Britain will suffer the worst tariffs in history if the government doesn't adjust its stance. And European leaders? They are quietly shifting their positions. French President Marine Le Pen and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz have signaled their willingness to engage with Trump's policies, leaving Britain increasingly isolated. And still, Starmer refuses to move. His private meetings with King Charles have reportedly become more tense by the day, with sources close to the palace suggesting that the king is running out of patience. One insider, speaking on condition of anonymity, put it bluntly, the Prime Minister is playing with fire. His Majesty sees it as his duty to act in the best interests of the British people. If the government refuses to do so, action will be taken. What does that mean? Will King Charles actually force the issue? Could he challenge Starmer's authority directly? Make no mistake, the consequences of such an action would be seismic. It would ignite a constitutional battle unseen in modern British history. But the public, it seems, would support it. A bombshell poll has revealed that 64% of Britons would back the king if he moved to intervene. And let's be clear, this is not just a public revolt. It is an internal one. Labour MPs are panicking. Sources from within the party suggest that multiple senior figures are preparing to break ranks. There are whispers of a coordinated resignation threat from within the cabinet, a move that could shatter Starmer's government overnight. Treasury officials have privately admitted that if Rachel Reeves resigns, the government could collapse. And yet, Downing Street remains in denial. Starmer has reportedly told aides that he will not be bullied by the monarchy, the press, or the public. That he will stay the course, no matter the consequences. That he will weather the storm. But what happens when the storm turns into a full-blown hurricane? The economic damage is mounting. Public anger is at a boiling point. The king is standing firm. And the Labour Party is fracturing. And so now we face the inevitable question, how much longer can Starmer survive? Because let's be honest, his position is becoming untenable. His government is sinking. His authority is crumbling. And unless he makes a drastic reversal, he may very well be forced out of power in one of the most spectacular political collapses in British history. The next 48 hours will decide it all. Will Starmer bend under the weight of overwhelming pressure, or will he push the monarchy to its limit, forcing King Charles to test the true extent of his constitutional power? Whatever happens next, Britain will never be the same again.